Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much, Alexandra and Steffi, for having us. We would like to use the next 35 minutes to explore the future of mobility and transportation, especially in urban environments, where we all experience in our everyday life how the level of congestion goes up, not only by people driving their cars or riding on Ubers, but also increasingly driven by the success of e-commerce and the problems arising through parcel delivery. And I have a whole set of ambitious and successful founders of new mobility and logistics companies here with me. And before we get to the introduction, I would quickly like to say a few words about myself. I've been on the entrepreneur side for quite some time, and after my brother and I sold our company to Google back in 2012, I turned VC. Today, I'm one of the partners in the Western European tech business of Earlybird, and Earlybird is one of the larger European early-stage technology funds. We manage about $1 billion in aggregate, focused on seed, but primarily on Series A. So before diving deeper into the subject, may I first ask Georg to introduce himself. Georg is, like me, German citizen who actually went to engineering school in Switzerland and then just recently relocated to New York City in order to build the US base for Teralytics. Georg, can you give us a bit of a background?
Very happy to. And does this mic work? I think it does, right? Yeah, so I'm co-founder and head of product at Teralytics. We are a company that was founded back in Zurich, Switzerland, out of the ETH Zurich, ETH Zurich. And we are understanding human mobility, so the way that people move around from A to B in a great detail and depth. And we do so by partnering with telecom network operators. And we're getting anonymized data sets from telecom network operators, so like the companies you get your phone contract, your mobile phone contract from. And from this we can understand, by the fact that phones are switching between cell towers, we can identify how people flow across the city. And so we are one of the very, very few companies in the world that understand, for example, here across the US or across Germany, we are understanding human mobility across all modes of transport, how many people are taking a subway from Brooklyn to Manhattan today, how many Uber trips just happened from the Upper West Side to the financial district, because we're also seeing the app and web usage data of people, and so we can have the full aggregate of human mobility. And this data is being used by our customers, which are, half of it is public sector, are transportation operators, subway operators. The Singaporean subway system, for example, is being run with the help of our real-time data sets, but also large car manufacturers who are moving into the mobility space. Are buying the data as well as ride-sharing companies.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And passing the mic on to Killian, who's the co-founder of Brand Commerce. You recently successfully raised your seed round, basically a middle layer of APIs that's integrating retail but also e-commerce to solve problems around logistics, especially in cities. Can you give us a bit of a detail, Killian?
Of course, absolutely. So what Brand Commerce does is connect to the inventory systems and point of sale systems of brick and mortar retailers to create a virtual warehouse or a mesh of products available in real time from an entire city. So effectively creates the infrastructure that Amazon has, but at a distance of 30 miles by using the inventory within a city. So what we know in real time is the availability of a specific product based on a user's location and their needs, and the way to get that to them as quickly as possible in as little as 30 to 40 minutes.
Thanks, Killian. And now, Brad, you are the co-founder and CEO of Depot Global. Unlike the other two in our round, you are still in stealth mode. Your cloud software is orchestrating asset owners around mobility in cities. And we would be, of course, especially curious to understand a little bit more where you currently are and what we can expect once you launch.
Good morning, everyone. So we're based in San Francisco. Depot Global is a software company that is working in the autonomous mobility space. And we're not teaching self-driving cars how to drive themselves and not hit things. We're teaching them how to take care of themselves. And so what that means is, adding a layer of situational intelligence for autonomous vehicles in a given city around how they get cleaned, around how they get themselves repaired, about how they handle incidents, about how they talk to the jurisdictions in which they're operating in the way that that jurisdiction's requiring them to speak to them. So it is like building a cloud-based intelligence on top of the individual discrete vehicles and those fleets of vehicles that are already being deployed. So we are in stealth, but I am happy to talk in a fair amount of detail because we're close to not being in stealth.
Yeah, I think this is a very, very interesting space to address. I mean, when you look at mobility from a high level, I think the major trends indeed are autonomous. It's electrification. It's sharing and connected, clearly, maybe as the three most relevant from our perspective. Now, in the autonomous space specifically, can you tell us a little bit of what impact the regulatory environment in the US, but maybe also compared to Europe, with GDPR coming up and so on, and data sharing between cars owned by their owners, and also the data then owned by their owners, and how that relates to the OEMs who want that data but cannot necessarily access it the way they want it in order to improve their AI to enhance the self-driving algorithms?
Yes, so I never ever thought I would be in the position as a serial entrepreneur to be saying that I'm excited about a regulatory framework. But I actually am, and the more I've gotten into this over the past year, meeting with leaders of states and of cities and of countries and transportation ministers in Europe, what's really unique about what's going on in this autonomous revolution is there's a keen awareness that what worked in the past and those metaphors around regulation and safety will not work in the future. I am actually seeing a significant change in disposition in a lot of the regulatory bodies, and we're working with the most forward-thinking of them already. But on the other side of it, from an entrepreneurial standpoint, there's an onus on people who are building companies that do touch the public domain to, from your very inception, think about a public policy position. And that's something that I think most Silicon Valley founders want to run away from. There's obviously, as a lot of you know, a very strong libertarian streak. I don't think that those founders are going to do very well trying to touch things that have a public infrastructure component. So the regulatory environment is nascent with respect to the autonomous revolution, but there are pockets of advanced thinking, and there are also pockets that it is literally the Wild West. I won't name the states, but there are Western US states that are pretty much the Wild West. That's an approach to say, let the private market sort it out. There are other states on the East Coast that are very forward-thinking, putting a minimalistic regulatory safety-centric framework in place, but allowing the private market and companies like mine to step in and provide private market solutions that do provide the data privacy and security issues that the fleet operators care about and ultimately the riders will care about. So it will be thorny and uneven for probably the next decade, but these things, I think it's exciting because they will sort themselves out. I don't know if you...
Yeah, chip in at any time.
Yeah, I mean, I think the regulators have an interesting role to play, which is exactly this balancing act, right, between protecting the public but also ensuring innovation and making sure that your city is at the forefront of new mobility. I mean, we at Theoretics, at least we believe that there will emerge independent players who are providing this independent and inclusive picture of mobility in a city and will inform then also policy decisions from a more independent point of view. So far, cities have, the only way to obtain basically information, what is the impact of Uber, was forcing Uber to give some data, right? And we don't think that doesn't work, because this also only gives them a very, very partial view of the mobility, and also doesn't provide independent, trusted source of what's happening. And yes, companies like Theoretics are right now today. We are providing cities with the understanding what is the impact of Uber, how many empty rides are driver making in the city and causing congestion versus taking away cars off the road. So I think these players like Theoretics will play a key role. as long as also the data really represents all parts of the population, right? I mean, issue of Uber is they represent 1% of all mobility. I mean, this is the pitch of Uber to say we can grow from 1% to 100%, but there really needs to be a player which sees the full picture, not just 1%.
Yeah, absolutely. And from our point of view, I guess the challenge that we see is that consumer behaviors and also tech companies are moving faster than regulation does. So ultimately, the pressure that human demand for either product or mobility solutions places on the infrastructure of a city, whether that's bicycle couriers, semi-autonomous vehicles, scooters in San Francisco, for example, regulations are struggling to cope with the demand that that places on the streets and the effect that that creates on the human capital required to deploy it.
Can you maybe, Killian, diving a little bit deeper into your product, can you explain a little bit or exemplify how your product helps retailers or e-commerce players in that respect?
Of course, absolutely. So it's important to say that we sit sort of a tier above the mobility space. So our thesis is that the last mile is very, very broken, obviously. It's an extremely expensive way to deliver anything. It doesn't work for most consumers, but behavior, particularly driven by Amazon Prime, is moving rapidly towards 1 hour fulfillment. That's something that's very hard for brick and mortar retailers to sustain. And we all see the statistics about how quickly the retail world is changing, right? Particularly in the US or in China, dominated by effectively 2 online retailers. So what we do is help physical brick and mortar retailers survive this shift by surfacing all of their inventory in real time and helping route that product directly to consumers with the shortest route to delivery possible. So that could be through Postmates, it could be Homer Logistics, it could be another fulfillment layer. And again, back to this issue of regulation and the actual demand placed on it. For us, we believe that that's going to take probably 5 years to either self-regulate or correct. So we sit a tier above that. We work with all of those partners to route product in real time based on consumer need and the nearest available SKU of that inventory.
And how fast? I mean, everybody's talking about drone delivery and robotic delivery, but in fact, 99.99% of the market is still either basically car or some bike maybe, yeah, and some scooter. How fast do you see these trends actually being adopted in the kind of the most cutting edge cities, be it in the Western world or also in Asia?
I think Georg and Brad and I were just speaking about it before we got on stage. You know, drones are an amazing use case. They look great. Bezos gets to show them off a lot, but practically speaking, we're not going to have drones doing deliveries in densely populated urban areas. Maybe ever, probably not for a very long time. We do need alternatives, partial automation, complete automation, electrification, there's no question. You know, both the financial, economic feasibility of last mile with people is not necessarily sustainable, but I think drones in cities is hard. I think Brad has a different view.
There's already a Reddit thread of folks trying to figure out how to hack and steal content from drones or delivery robots. The latest one, a British company just announced a surface-based little, like bigger than a shoebox delivery vehicle. And some guy posted, easy, put a bag over it, spray paint it, use a local EMP to take out the battery, throw it in a van.
Yeah.
So those are security issues.
Yeah, I think the reality of logistics is it's a lot less sexy for the next decade, right? It is certainly probably partial automation, it's electrification, and it's efficiency through scale, which is going to sound very anachronistic, but it's back to vehicles that we saw in the 1960s. You know, the UK had the milk float, which like an electric vehicle back in the 70s that delivered milk, right, on a daily basis. That's actually a far more sustainable model for delivery than 1,000 guys on bikes or, you know, drones. And I think we'll see some of those models recur in the next decade, you know.
Can I add one thing? There is an interesting compression of adoption of autonomous technologies, whether it's delivery or for ride hailing. If we've been tracking this space at my company for like a couple of years as we were leading up to building the company, and I've never seen in tracking industries like the compression of time, the leftward shift of adoption of a space like I'm seeing. And my theory, which is I guess as good as anyone looking at it, is when you have compounding exponential curves that are stacking on top of each other, and yet some of them are actually interacting and leveraging ML and AI in ways that no one predicted, you can see a leftward shift of the adoption of the space. So is it 2 years? Is it 5? Is it 10? I literally think it's impossible to predict that because it's really
very fair,
gnarly, complex adoption space.
Agreed. I think because of the space that we sit in at Brand Commerce, our view is what we want to do is make the distance shorter from the customer to the product rather than speed up the delivery itself. So we look at predictive analysis of where product exists based on users' behavior, time of day, time of week, and understand from that or infer from that where product needs to be delivered to in advance to shorten that distance for delivery.
Are you like an open systems version of what Amazon has built, a proprietary
I couldn't possibly pass that comment, but we'd like to think so.
That sounds like what you're building.
We're hoping.
That's very cool.
Georg, maybe coming back to you and also the huge amount of data and insight that you have at Teralytics, can you, and given that you're not only expanding into the US now, but also selling to public or private customers in Asia, I would be curious to understand how do you see kind of the Western versus the Eastern hubs, and I mean, we are coming from a thinking where Silicon Valley is the cutting edge in everything, but I mean, German automotive OEMs thought the same, so for the past 20 years, and now not only Tesla is kind of pushing hard on them, but also Chinese e-mobility manufacturers are taking off at scale. So how do you see that?
Very, very interesting question. I mean, we're seeing a number of different aspects. Right? One is, for example, that the US public infrastructure is notoriously underfunded. Right? I mean, if you're riding the subway here, this is, I mean, it's, and then you're going to Singapore or Hong Kong, this is like day and night, right, in terms of the quality of transportation you're experiencing. And so I think there needs to be a shift happening here, because I don't think in 10 years' time everybody will ride an Uber, right? It's just not the, if I'm taking an Uber from here to the Upper West Side, this costs me easily $20, $30. That is not, that is for the top 10% that's a viable option, but not for the rest of the population. And we believe, I mean, transportation needs to be built to meet the needs for everyone. And I think some of these Asian markets and also the state actors there have definitely gotten that message, right? And are also investing much more aggressively in that space. I mean, the price tickets we can command for the data sets we are bringing to the market in the Asian markets are definitely higher, and also the sales cycle is much shorter because they are acting faster, they are more forward thinking than some of the actors here. No blame to the US. I think it's also a very simple function of federal funding, which is just much harder to come by. And then there's the second aspect of mobility services, where we see the US was early, the West Coast was early, Uber, Lyft, these players were early, and we see now, we just saw that Uber left Southeast Asia, right? They just left. They handed over the business to Grab. They had to leave China, they had to hand this over to Didi. And we're seeing, if you're in Indonesia, you call a Grab, right? This is not a car, this is a motorcycle that picks you up, right? So they've found some interesting twists on these mobility services, making it allowing it much broader adoption, because also the price points for a motorcycle, for example, is much lower than having a full car running from A to B. So I think we're seeing some interesting innovations in the mobility services space, which also, like let's stay with the example of Indonesia, like people don't make the leap from a car to mobility services. They make the leap from not having a car to using mobility services. They just jumping ahead a whole generation of what here in the US, I mean, still everybody loves a car. We just spoke about it before. I think that's a very exciting and of course very competitive area we're seeing. But if you look at, like, you might have read all these headlines about like these electric scooters in San Francisco, like Bird and these players. Guess who produces the scooter? It's Xiaomi, right? It's a Chinese scooter that they are renting out in San Francisco now on the streets.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting observation from basically from not owning a personal, like a vehicle, a car, to jumping to using mobility services. So a little bit like like what we also saw in some parts of Asia and Africa, basically from jumping over the desktop age and going right onto mobile. Yeah, a very interesting aspect. And I recently looked into some figures regarding the automotive industry specifically. So currently we have, just so you have an idea, about 1.4 billion cars out there, and about 100 million are sold each year, but only 10 to 12 million are being retired. So the net growth is still, say, plus 90 million year over year. Not so much fueled by Europe and North America as developed markets, but especially by emerging. However, KPMG says by 2025, less than half of the people they surveyed globally still intend to own a car. Yeah.
And I'm still, I mean, I would love to hear your perspective. I mean, I'm here now in the US, so farther away from Germany, but like because I'm German, I very much follow also the European car manufacturers. And I've seen things like Daimler and BMW merging their two mobility service businesses into a joint venture, which, I mean, doesn't look like their core future thing. It sounds like a side thing they can put in a joint venture and then continue making cars. I'm just wondering what's the strategy of these big car OEMs to compete with these mobility services. I don't see it. The second interesting aspect we are seeing is that lots of these car OEMs are trying to launch their own mobility services, right? Like in Uber, they're competing to Uber or competing to Lyft. What they always have as a precondition is to use their own car, or in some cases even a specifically developed car for that mobility service before they launch, which results in timelines, which is like they can't launch their service before a year's time because this takes them to produce a specific car for the new mobility service. Where I'm saying like this is not, like Uber doesn't care whether they're driving a Toyota or whatever, or a Ford. I mean, this just says very well the established OEMs still want to, of course, use Ford when Ford launches a mobility service.
But Ford just stopped making cars.
Well, still SUVs is my understanding, right?
Which left several AV players out in the wind since they were using the Ford Focus platform. Yeah. My take on this, so I grew up in Michigan. There's 2 points to that. One, I grew up in an automotive family. And my family's business was automotive fleet repair. So I've gone around to being back in the original industry that my family started in, only from a software standpoint. But the other point is Michigan is representative of this huge swath that we very derisively call flyover country, which I hate. But that part, which is most of America, if you've spent any time there, I think like my relatives, these are pickup truck, deer hunting, driving dudes who are never, ever, ever going to want to get into a self-driving vehicle.
And Frank, I also don't see the economics. Like with US being so sparsely populated, it's very, very hard to make economics work of shared mobility, right? Compared to a city like the mega cities in Asia.
I will be willing to make a bet. In 2050, if you go to Iowa or you go to Wisconsin or Kansas, you're going to see a lot of L4 vehicles that are still just being driven around because it's part of the culture. Right, and it's not going to be an L5. You know, guys are going to take the self-driving L5 car to go deer hunting, right? It's just
and they will own their car, right? They won't share it, right?
Yes, it will be owned. The averages, when we read about these decrease in the number of car units that are going to be produced, it's a very deceiving number. We've seen some really scary numbers. If you're in the automotive industry and you're an OEM, like 90% reduction. I don't buy it, because it's a very uneven set of steps that happen across a really complex landscape. Every city, every state, every territory, every country has a radically different set of dynamics that are almost innumerable that go into what the number of desired vehicles will be and what those use cases are. I think the grand narrative of there will be less cars made, yes, but it's going to be very uneven, and I think in those pockets of opportunity, there will be the opportunity for reformulated OEMs to actually thrive. And I think Ford is very smart to be trying to skate to where the puck will be to be able to survive that. But not everyone's going to survive, and there will be new players.
Yeah, and to that point, I think, and again, mobility in that sense isn't specifically our space, but as we look at it, obviously we focus on densely populated urban areas, right, cities, and we look at mass influx, you know, in terms of humankind moving towards the city, and we see that as a long-term evolution of how mobility will affect that, both logistics and infrastructure, right? So there's no question car ownership will probably exist, like the capital acquisition of cars in semi-rural or rural areas, but long-term in a city, that's both not equitable or sustainable. I think that's what we're focused on.
Yeah, Kilian, maybe coming again back to basically to the purpose of your product, helping traditional retailers transform into the digital age, compete with Amazon. When you look at Amazon, I mean, I think what's so scary about basically how they evolve is just the depth of integration is getting crazy deep. So you saw them a year, 2 years ago, basically building an own freight forwarding business for air freight, getting an NVOCC license to have their own ocean carrier ships going at some point. So they just go deeper, 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 all the way, basically door to door. And what has to happen, or what are the means that those traditional retailers have, also on a unit economics basis, to really sustain against that?
It's such a good question, and candidly, I think, if you take a snapshot right now of where retail is and you project forward in a decade, it's very hard to imagine most of the physical retailers that we see sustaining themselves based on the economics, the margins that they have. And for all of the reasons that you've described, it's not just Amazon, but fundamentally the downward pressure on retail is huge. When we look at fulfillment, and taking the Amazon example, not to make them the whipping boy, but candidly, they're 20 years old. They're sort of a legacy player, although they're very innovative. The reality is their infrastructure is built on a very traditional fulfillment model. They operate huge warehouses, massive fleet management, enormous amounts of infrastructure. And as we look forward to automation or partial automation, we think that's the edge that's necessary to sustain physical retail, right? So rely on the idea that Amazon can ship products 1 hour from central warehouse in New Jersey to distribution centers in Harlem and then spawn that out is very capital and resource intensive in the short term. There's no question that Amazon are making huge steps to bridge that very last mile, and obviously micro warehousing is a huge part of that, but that's what's going to sustain the retailer, I think.
Just from hearing you describe your company, it seems like you would have a really powerful, back to the public policy front, narrative to give to cities and states and to countries that you're enabling the survival of retail, right, in those locations.
Candidly, it's absolutely it, right? We can't say that we're going to save every retailer, but we think we can sustain them. And in addition to that, we can also reduce waste, which sounds a bit soft, but we've all had Amazon deliveries. The amount of packaging that you receive for one object is mind-blowing. And that's a function of where it's coming from, the distribution and fulfillment process, right? That's not necessary for local retailers. There are more efficient models. So we have to forgo some of the efficiencies we take for granted. Right now we expect door-to-door delivery, like a guy knocks on our apartment door or our building door. We need to get used to curbside pickup. There are some realities that need to take place. But the efficiencies that will be gleaned both for retail and also for humankind are very substantial.
Budget for lobbyists in your next round.
We'll do that.
Yeah, we have a few minutes left. Please, at any time, we have two microphones for questions from the audience. Let's do that interactively. So at any time, if you have questions, please raise your hand and let us know. Other than that, using the last couple of minutes remaining for a little bit of a forward-looking or outlook perspective. So Brad, now that you're still in stealth, can you give us an idea of what the next major milestones for brand commerce will be over the next 6-12 months? What can we expect?
You want me to talk about his company, Brand Commerce? I'm happy to do that.
I'll take it back.
Sorry.
He's going to raise a monster A round, right? 100 on 500. Yeah.
No comment.
Yeah, for Depot, the next milestones for us are, so we sit at an interesting intersection between public infrastructure entities and then private companies that are developing and putting these fleets into work. So eventually when we do come out of stealth, you would expect that there would be announcements that place us in the middle of some of those relationships, right? That's all I'll say right now.
Here we go.
And in the meantime, I'm recruiting engineers.
For your San Francisco office?
Yeah, San Francisco right now. Yeah.
Killian, do you want to?
Sure, I'll jump in. We have a sort of medium-term, but we believe very far-reaching thesis about where fulfillment in e-commerce goes. And bear with me, because this is where I sound like the tinfoil or aluminum hat-wearing man. Right now, you buy from a mobile device, and you add things to a shopping cart, which is a trope that exists because we still have shopping baskets when we go to stores. That's going to die. The idea that you're going to browse a device and add things to a basket and have them scheduled for delivery will go away. The point of friction that we have at the moment is it's expensive to deliver things and timely. If we can remove that and make that more efficient, you'll get things when you need them. They'll simply show up, right? You won't think about it. It will happen based on context and intent. So I leave the gym, I need an electrolytic drink, it shows up. I don't need to enter an address or wait 2 hours for delivery. That sounds like science fiction, but if you consider the data that we collect on your phones, the tracking and the capability we have to know where you're going, the intent that's there, and just bridging the gap to delivery, it's an inevitability. And our bet is on understanding how we get that product to you as quickly as possible in the most efficient fashion possible. And we're also recruiting for engineers, but we're in New York. Yes, a question.
Hi, I have a question about these empty storefronts here in New York. We all know that Madison Avenue, easily $80,000 a month. Lexington Avenue, maybe only 60. But on some blocks, there are like 6 stores that are empty, 3 on each side. What are these people waiting for? Will they ever wake up and understand that nobody can pay these type of rents anymore because retail is dead?
Look, I think it's a very good point, and it goes to the sort of macro level issue of the economics of cities, right? As you said, you've got the sort of land value issue, and a really good microcosm of this actually is malls. So Credit Suisse has a statistic that 30% of malls in the US will close by 2020. So it's an immense amount of inventory that was the backbone of retail for 30 or 40 years will disappear. The physical space will exist, but it has no purpose yet. Our view on it is that retail will fundamentally be repurposed as either an experience space in one capacity, right, like what you've got with Apple or Samsung, or Bonobos or some of the other D2C businesses, and that purchase may majoritively happen online. That's not to say you won't buy physically in retail ever, but we think that will reduce. And our view would be that micro-warehousing will take over, which is the idea of getting product closer to consumers in spaces you don't enter, but ensure that we can get it to you faster. To your question, though, of what happens with the space in the short term, candidly, that's the sort of human condition. That's greed and inertia. And I think that will change with time. There'll be no choice.
There's another question, the gentleman here in the first row.
Killian, are the retailers accepting your thesis, or are they too scared to move on the idea of tradition and inertia, words you just used?
I think it's a fair question. Candidly, it depends on the retailer. The majority of evidence that we would have is that retailers are very frightened, particularly independent retailers, like a small corner store. It's a pretty bleak outlook right now for you, right? Aside from Amazon, just technology and literacy about the platforms isn't there, so they need the support and assistance to grow with it. So they're broadly open to it if it represents an opportunity to win, to get sales.
Right? One more question.
I would like to know if the infrastructure, the street infrastructure in big American cities is ready for autonomous cars, or if not, what is required to get it there?
So, great question, and the answer, of course, unsatisfactorily is it depends on the city. Interestingly, though, Pittsburgh has been one of the main early test beds because Carnegie Mellon, of course, is where autonomy was developed. Pittsburgh doesn't have great roads. Don't tell Mayor Peduto that, but and sometimes those cars that are on the road there, they come to a construction zone, or there's something wrong on the road, and they just stop today. So that's a very real issue. The first cities where you're seeing this happen tend to, for the most part, be flat cities with good streets. Sometimes the AV companies will put themselves into an intentionally complex situation like Pittsburgh or Boston so that they can learn, which is very important for feeding simulations in the future. But the good news is how we were thinking about what this would look like 3 years ago and what the sensor dynamics would have to be like to be installed in the city itself has shifted with the advances in AI and ML in the sensors themselves, so that there's a comparatively minimal capital investment required by these cities, and it's the burden of the technology itself to solve it, which is pretty remarkable and I think unexpected. I think when we talked about this in the past, people thought the cities would have to somehow come up with magic millions, right, to make this work, and that's not going to be the case. In fact, I think cities will find a way to make a lot of money off of autonomous vehicles.
And just to answer to this a little bit differently, I think with the arrival of AVs and then also with the arrival of mobility services on top of AVs, I think we have the chance to actually change how roads are being built or not built anymore in American cities. And I think the best example you have just outside there behind your back, which is the West Side Highway. And we were just talking before that I'm living close by here, right? I'm like in the evenings when I'm going running here, this is not a nice waterfront, right? I mean, there's like in every car here that currently queues at this traffic light, one guy sits in this car, right? And like this is why we need this West Side Highway and are not having a nice waterfront here and at the Hudson River. So I think with this whole arrival of shared mobility with more people in one car, you can shut down some of these roads and actually turn them into parks and beautiful waterfronts, as hopefully the West Side Highway will be in 10 years.
All right, that's a just-in-time landing. Thank you, Killian, Georg, Brad, and thanks for listening, and enjoy the conference.